Hello, welcome to Straightforward Levant TV's political debate show. Last week we started to see the ripple effect of the Iran nuclear deal as Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond attended a ceremony in Tehran with Iranian diplomats to mark the reopening, while Iran has also reopened its embassy in London. At the ceremony, Mr. Hammond said the attack in 2011 had been a low point, but since the election of President Hassan Rouhani, things had steadily improved step by step. Mr. Hammond then said last month historic nuclear agreement was another milestone and showed the power of diplomacy conducted in an atmosphere of mutual respect to solve shared challenges. Will Britain be able to charm Iran when it comes to the race to foreign investment in there? And what are the obstacles and limitations of economic ties with an Islamic nation like Iran? How will other countries in the West benefit from the deal, and will Iran make sure it's a win-win situation? To discuss those economic and political relations, I am joined today by Dr. Nasser Al-Kalawoon, Professor of Economics at London University, and Mr. Robert Olds of the Bruges Group here in London, and also member of the Conservative Party. Welcome on Straightforward again. Before we get into our discussion today, let's have a look at this brief report on Iran.
We will work together to deal with the scourge of terrorism.
International sanctions on Iran could start to be lifted as early as spring next year, British Foreign Minister said on Monday, as Tehran and the West rebuild their ties and potentially open up billions of dollars of trade deals. Six world powers struck a deal on July 14th in Vienna to lift sanctions in return for Iran to limit its nuclear activity that the West suspected was aimed at creating a nuclear bomb. Speaking a day after raising the British flag at a reopening ceremony at Britain's embassy in Tehran, British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond said he expected Iran and the United States could endorse the deal by October. Combined with Iran meeting its commitments in the deal, that could see the start of trade restrictions being lifted. A range of restrictions on Iran have been imposed over several decades, dating back to 1979, when Iranian students stormed the US embassy in Tehran. Oil-related sanctions were imposed by the United States and the European Union in 2012. Eyeing deals between British firms and Iran, particularly in the oil and financial sectors, Hammond said preparatory work should be done ahead of lifting sanctions so investment can start to flow as soon as the measures are removed. European firms are racing to secure business opportunities in Iran after the UN Security Council adopted the historic deal. The deal between Iran and six world powers, led by the United States, must be approved by Iran's top security committee and parliament before it can be finally implemented. Iran's deputy foreign minister has urged a speedy approval in Tehran so that blame for any failure falls on US lawmakers who have until 17th September to formally weigh in on the agreement.
Mr. Olds, let's start by talking about the nuclear deal when it comes to its context and its framework, and how it's best, in your opinion, for Britain to look at it today.
Well, this nuclear deal could have been reached 10 years ago. Back in 2005, Iran offered Britain and the European Union a solution to this ongoing crisis. But of course, they knew that the Bush administration in the United States would not be willing, because there was always an alternative agenda behind these sanctions, behind the concern about Iran's nuclear program. Iran actually abandoned a nuclear weapons program in 2003 and does not have the technology nor the highly enriched uranium or plutonium that would be needed for a nuclear weapon. Really, this is a civilian nuclear program that, of course, is advanced, but of course, is not a nuclear weapons program. Of course, other countries have concerns about Iran developing its nuclear technology, but as things stand, this is not a nuclear weapons program. So really the sanctions are misplaced, and this crisis has been resolved 10 years too late, really. But finally, Britain should welcome this. We should always welcome good relations with Iran, because Iran is an incredibly important country. It has a growing population. It has a very large proportion of people who speak English, has a sort of global outlook. It is not an aggressive country invading other states, although neighbouring countries do follow that policy. Iran does not. We should welcome this and engage with Iran. And Iran has actually been looking for investment, looking for economic development, looking for partners a lot longer than since the election of President Rouhani. It's actually been open to investment from other countries for many years now. I was attending such a conference in 2013, which was about investment in the oil industry and developing industry within Iran. That was long before Rouhani was actually elected. So there is scope for engagement with Iran, and really finally the West is actually catching up with Iran and catching up whether they want to be positively engaged with countries around the world and finally, hopefully, eliminate the sanctions and look at investing and developing the Iranian economy and sharing the wonderful opportunities that would exist with a partnership with Iran.
Dr. Al-Kalawoon, as a political economist, do you think the concerns of the GCC bloc over the deal were not only over security per se, but also economic fears where they might lose part of their business with the West to Iran?
It's a good question. I come in fresh from a conference in Cambridge organized by the Gulf Research Center, and Iran and GCC is a major set-in for 3 days talk. It has 11 sessions. One of them is Iran and GCC. I got the impression from the discussions that Iran's trade with Russia is receding, while GCC trade with Russia is progressing to $4.5 billion, where Iran now is like 1.5. So in this case, it gives you an indication, number one. Number two, as matters of technicality, is a nuclear issue, and I agree with Mr. Olds that Iran, it might not be putting a declared goal on the table since long time to have a nuclear program military style, but it has a rocket program, it's proven to be fine. And it has some other issues as well in nuclear scientists and ulterior motives. It relies on non-state actors in the Arab world and in the Middle East as well as overseas. So it goes to minorities and try to empower itself. I'm not saying it's bad in itself. When it goes to terrorism, this is another issue. It comes to that strategic, at the end of the day with GCC, strategic, let's say, direction of relationship. Former President Khatami tried with King Abdullah 10 years ago to have a kind of rapprochement regardless of the Bush administration, kind of red line to any rapprochements with Iran. It was not successful for Bush administration opposition, and number two, the hardliners in Iran opposition. It didn't produce results. But however, there were attempts by the GCC to find a common ground and resolve issues of regional security, Arab security as well in Lebanon, in Iraq and others. It didn't come to fruition. In my belief, for having two kinds of Iran, or two elites in Iran fighting, the radicals and the moderates, and each time they rotate with one another. So you get the same kind of declaration to have business with everyone, but at the same time, Iran wants a relationship with the West, but the expense of Israel and the Arab bloc, and it might have its own way for the short term now.
But do you think business will be lost to Iran because of this stance that the GCC is taking at the moment? We see a huge appetite for Iran from Germany, from Britain, and the West in general. Do you think the GCC might regret its stance over the nuclear deal?
I don't think so. There is a kind of damage limitation exercise now. There are other negotiations trying to push the Americans to give guarantees to restrict Iran's kind of freedom of maneuver in the Middle East. Iran does push Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia internally, and push Yemen as well, push Lebanon, the Lebanese government. So it has its own. I think there is a now kind of time to get concessions from Iran on these issues. It's pity it was not done before, as the Arab states wanted to have. So it's a kind of additional issue. But I agree.
So the biggest problem in countries like Bahrain and Yemen are probably Saudi Arabia rather than Iran. It's Saudi Arabia that's effectively occupying Bahrain, not Iran.
Well, this is debatable in one thing, because as I said, Iran relies on non-state actors. So in a way, legally speaking, yes, it's not doing anything bad as matter sending armies. I agree, even in Iraq it doesn't send. However, General Soleimani of Al-Quds Brigade moves freely in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, everywhere. So in a way, he kind of coordinator of Iranian, let's say militia activities around to
arguably fighting the non-state actors of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And those non-state actors are Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and they're a bigger threat to people's human rights than any organisation that has the support of Iran. And of course, when it comes to Syria, Iran is actually backing the government of President Assad. Of course, there's controversy surrounding that, but it has more support, arguably, than ISIS and these other organisations that are being supported, these really vicious terrorists that are being supported by the West's so-called allies in the Gulf states.
When we mention non-state powers like ISIS, obviously, and not comparing, of course, but Hezbollah, for example, as a proxy for Iran in the region, can we say that they both, in the eyes of the West, have this problematic factor of being an Islamist power, in the sense how they become radical?
Well, the West has actually been very sympathetic to Islamists in Syria, wanting to support or turn a blind eye, at the very least, to Salafists, that because they Sunni various extremists, because they want to stop the growth of Iran, and of course Iran is a Shia power predominantly. So really the West is actually, in some senses, turning a blind eye, and it did turn a blind eye to Salafists in Syria until, of course, they started to undermine the American project in Iraq, which had largely failed. But we need to have a new paradigm of who we're looking at, who our allies are. Hezbollah is, of course, still labelled a terrorist organisation by the West, but in Syria, Hezbollah are protecting Christians, whereas the biggest threat to Christians is coming from ISIS and Al-Qaeda-backed organisations such as the Al-Nusra Front. So that's really a big change in a situation, and the West really needs to catch up with what's happening on the ground, recognise that we need to evaluate who our true friends are in the Middle East, and really the friendship that we have with countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, even elements in Kuwait, is serving us very poorly.
But you, as a member of the Conservative Party, do you blame someone when it comes to such foreign policy? You said it doesn't really serve, especially close links with Qatar when it comes to foreign policy. Do you approve of those in the party?
Well, it's very disappointing when David Cameron met the Emir of Qatar, when, of course, at the very same time, Qatar, not possibly the Emir, but elements within Qatar were directly funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So we have very good links. Of course, the London property market does rely on a lot of Qatari investment. But as your piece showed, it said a lot of the sanctions go back to 1979 and the Iranian storming of the US embassy. I think it's really time for the United States and Britain, which is sometimes a proxy to the United States, to move on. Really, we're not fighting the Cold War against Russia anymore, nor are we fighting a Cold War against Iran. We need to recognise that Iran is a very different country to various states in the Middle East. It wants to be open. Let's engage. Business will improve cultural links. It will help Iran's development. In the future, we'll have far better friendship with Iran than we will possibly with a country like Saudi Arabia, which has a far worse human rights record and, of course, a record of sponsoring the biggest threats to the region and, of course, the West as things stand, because the elements in that country have been very favourable to Al-Qaeda, and of course ISIS is actually an offshoot of Al-Qaeda.
Dr. Kalawoon, on the notion of Mr. Oul saying that Iran wants to be open and Iran is open, do you agree? Because some would argue that it's not an open state to foreign relations and economic ties. Maybe now it is.
I think there is an intention to go, but it's wrong to suppose that Iran will go in one direction. Over 30 years or 40 years, Iran goes into dual ones, going into being a hardliner in some respects and being very pragmatic on one. I recognize that in last January's Davos conference in Switzerland, President Rouhani met the chiefs of the oil companies and gas companies. It gives you a sign that they are needed there to upgrade Iran's energy sector. That's number one. Number two, on the part of the GCC, I believe, and this is taken seriously by the city here, the business, that there is not much engagement in economic terms between Saudi Arabia and Iran. However, UAE and Qatar wants to have engagement. Qatar shares a gas field with Iran, and UAE needs Iranian middle class and upper class to buy property and do deals. But at the same time, I see that every Iranian president coming to power has restrictions of he cannot deliver everything he promises, whether towards the Arab camp or towards the West. Now there is an opening or a kind of opportunity to start with, but at the same time, I would see, that the Conservative Party, from my perspective view, and David Cameron in particular, Prime Minister, needs Saudi money. 3 years ago, he went to Saudi Arabia to reveal for the first time the Saudi investment in Britain is over 64 billion pounds. We didn't know this number before. We knew it's big. So it tells you that, for me, the UK is a kind of the wealth manager of Saudi Arabia, of the
Qatar.
GCC, and it vies now to be of Iran. And this is win-win situation. The big question, can it keep it now in matters to push Iranian moderation and produce peace in Syria and Iraq and somewhere else? I'm doubtful to get anything in the short term.
I think pushing Iran is a mistake. We have had the Iranian Revolution because they were really fed up with Western intervention within their country. As there's a nationalistic element within Iran, is that they don't want to be told what to do. So what we should be doing is developing a different approach, which would be engaging positively with them, having good commercial links. From that, trade will develop, cultural links will develop, and of course Iran will then be on a course towards more moderation because it has a growing young population. And as long as we're not dictating to Iran what they should be doing, I think they would naturally move in the right direction because they want to develop their industry, not just their oil or gas industry, but they also want to develop the downstream industries, the industries that, where the real money is made from the oil and gas, from where they're producing products and actually developing a genuine industrial base. In the future, we could look at Iran and we talk about the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. We could add Iran to that as an extra eye. Iran does have a future that's looking very good, and we should be positively engaging and not dictating to them.
Well, speaking of the future now, the stance of Germany, for instance, during last month's visit of German Vice Chancellor and Economy and Energy Minister, Mr. Sigmar Gabriel, is that economic ties with Iran depend on Iran improving its relations with Israel. What do you think of this intertwining here, and do you think Britain will follow suit on this matter?
Well, Germany's looking to develop economic links there. Of course, there's been a lot of, I think, hysteria about Iran and Israel, saying that Iran was threatening to wipe Israel off the map. That's actually a misquotation from a former president, actually talking about ending the Israeli occupation of what they consider to be the Islam's holy places in Jerusalem. That's a very different statement. So there is a antipathy between some elements of Iran and Israel, but then Israel is recognised by very few states within the Middle East, although it does have an alliance at this moment in time with various Gulf states and various of those corrupt monarchies. Unofficial alliance, but it seems that they're following the same policy. They're all trying to encourage the United States to take a stronger position against Iran, and in a sense Israel is playing the bad cop in the game that the Sunni elites of these Gulf states are playing in Iran, where they're trying to isolate Iran and I think trying to settle religious scores that go back centuries.
But then mentioning alliances, could they not have just common interests on that particular notion? Because their fears are similar, be it security or the economy, when it comes to this deal. So, but you assert that they are alliances.
They're under-the-table alliances, as you mentioned. They're not official because they don't actually recognise the state of Israel. But it does seem that they're working very closely together. We saw that the Saudis were involved supporting the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt and putting back into power the army, which has always been good relations with Israel. The Egyptian army has had recently, anyway, good relations with Israel. So it does seem that there is some kind of alliance, and they're really not pushing for the destruction of Israel at all. There is, or for the creation of a Palestinian state. There is good relations, I'm sure, between Israel and various Gulf states.
Dr. Kaloun, how would you describe Iran's investment infrastructure? Now, in January 2014, last year, I hosted Professor Anoush Ehteshami, and we were talking about back then a potential interim deal that was after Mr. Rouhani became president, and what was considered as Mr. Rouhani's charm offensive, so as to get the ball rolling when it comes to the deal. Now, how would you describe the infrastructure, and is the country's Islamic nature compatible with the global business culture? Now, Mr. Ehteshami said there's a lot to be done in Iran so that it will eventually develop the right framework to absorb large-scale investment. So what do you think also when it comes to the Islamic nature of Iran and the culture of foreign investment?
Well, since Iran is having a kind of youth generation like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, which
Yes.
means high proportion of 75% are between like 15 to 28 years, which means high expectations. And this kind of group, if you don't have enough investment in short term to satisfy their own aspirations, you get social troubles as it happens everywhere. In Brazil and anywhere, demonstrations, regardless of the Islamic nature. Nobody in Iran disputes kind of the ideology of the regime. But the point, it is kind of to deliver to the new generation, this is one challenge. And that's why I see it, the weakness point in matters of the regime seeking a kind of deal with the West to unlock the sanctions as well as the aspirations of its own people. Don't forget that a few years ago, 6 years ago, with Mir Hussein Mousawi, you got people in the streets, regardless on which label. They were not anti-Islamic. They were, as well, the children of the revolution, but they didn't have their own economic aspirations, satisfied. So this is challenge number one for and they have a short term for it. Number two, to get the deal, now we see the groundwork is being done in matters of business dealings, visits by politicians, Philip Hammond, as you put in your report, but also the companies, British companies, know how to deal business with Iran easily. So
do they compare to the Gulf countries, for example, where it's been established economic relations, you have BP there, you have foreign companies?
Yeah, but with one difference that the oil companies and gas companies wouldn't get good concessions in Iran because Iran's fear, we come back to the ideology, that the Mossadegh, 1953, the oil companies had a hand in removing a nationalist government at that time. So we come back to the threat not only of ideology, to the security of the regime. They want the oil companies and gas companies to come and upgrade the system, do the service companies like Wood Group, like Petrofac, the pipelines, the kind of, the oil fields, whatever, to do the infrastructure. There is a huge need in Iran for this to be done. The big question, can this foreign investment and foreign companies employ enough Iranians into these new projects? Oil and gas sector doesn't employ or don't employ many people. It's very restricted sector. And mostly when you get foreign companies, you get foreign advisors, foreign engineers, whatever. Yes, Iran has a good, a kind of section of people who are educated, to good communication
usually
sector.
Overseas, though, in the oil and gas.
This is a challenge now to cut a good deal like China did, a transfer of technology, as well as employing enough Iranians to keep them off the streets. Otherwise, we are going to have in 2 years or 3 years, assuming the deal sticks and ideology recedes by nature, people will improve their own lives, they will travel, they will do everything then to satisfy. Otherwise, Iran will be doing kind of openness, but it will be a detriment for the regime.
So when it comes to protecting this sense of nationalism, when it comes to large-scale businesses, obviously we cannot expect in the near future, even the long run, any form of Aramco in Iran, for example?
No, short term, I think the concessions will be to keep Iranian hands, especially through the national oil company, on whatever concessions they get. And I think foreign companies do recognize this. But they are fighting to get a piece of the pie, because there were deals already with Korean companies and Japanese companies up to 2010, and they stopped because of the sanctions. Don't forget that foreign banks, British banks, they got hefty penalties from US bodies and from UK bodies, but mostly US for breaching the sanctions and dealing with Iran illegally. So in this case, and still now is going on despite the deal. So the legal battle, it benefits the American Treasury, by the way. So in this case, people are watching their own steps. But I think the deal is meant by its own nature to be gradual. Yes, the fight is to get concessions, but we'll start with the easy option, which means go to infrastructure projects, not nuclear ones, which has no military nature. Iran can rely on Russia for this. And I think in this case, it can succeed to pacify. Iran wants to be on good behavior short term to pass the deal through Congress and through other countries. And then from January, it will speak another way.
Mr. Olds, it's no secret that the appetite for investment in Iran, like we just learned, is on the high, yet risk is another factor when it comes to making sure that the attitude changes towards the West in Tehran. Now, let's be clear, during the talks and during critical moments, the last moments of the talks, Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, called for death of America. And he does have his influence, especially amongst the youth, which are the majority in Iran. Now, under such not so positive stances, is it safe to set a multi-million-dollar business in Iran that might perhaps be sabotaged, boycotted, or even burned down by some radical groups?
That's regularly quoted, but Iran has very considerable infrastructure already. When I was there over 2.5 years ago, they were talking about privatisation, talking about getting private investment, developing industry in a partnership with the West. It was very much not about asking just for Western money into Iranian businesses, but actually looking at models of private investment. They want to fully engage. That's the key thing about Iran, is that they do want to have an open economy. They have a high proportion of women in higher education than men, which is pretty much equal to the population, which has a high percentage of women at the moment. They have many women in terms of engineers. People have what's the work ethic, what in the West we'd call the Protestant work ethic. In Iran, they have their own work ethic. They're very hard-working, ingenious people. They want to develop their economy because partly the regime, of course, does recognise that economic growth is a key factor to power. Most governments are there on the commitment that they will deliver a better future for its young people and a growing economy. But also, they also recognise, because I've seen this evidence, that if there is economic growth, then that eliminates poverty, then that actually eliminates people who are living in awful conditions. That is one of the key aspirations of the Iranian government. And so it really does make sense to get involved. It makes sense for everyone. It gives them the political position that they want, but of course it will also lead to an organic change. This is what the West should stop trying to force change upon Iran, because the Iranians don't want to be told what to do. We should engage with them, and change will happen organically within their own country from Iran, at its own time, at its own speed, but not through the Western policy of regime change and interference in countries, which has proved to have failed in every single state where it's been tried.
And now let's move to our next section. During the reopening of Britain's Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond of the UK British Embassy in Tehran, he said there were no limits to what Britain and Iran might achieve together over time, though they wouldn't always agree. But for many Iranians, the compound with the lion and unicorn on the pillars of the gate of the embassy is also a symbol of Britain's past meddling in their country. As a precaution, riot police were lined up outside the gates of the British Embassy in Tehran, and inside, graffiti left by radicals who invaded it in 2011, just 4 years back, is still on the doors, and panelling above a portrait of the Queen is the message, "Death to England." So how is England going to reshape Iran's attitude towards its foreign policy? Who amongst Britain's political parties are going to get it right when it comes to Iran between Labour and Conservative, and who amongst the regional players in the Middle East might have high potential in doing business with Iran? Mr. Olds, on this note, let's talk about Britain. Some say it's a good thing having a Conservative government as the deal with Iran took place finally. Now, the Conservative Party is seen as usually more open, arguably, and more looking towards the future of better relations with global players. Now, be it diplomacy or economic ties. How would you elaborate on this?
Well, hopefully the Conservative Party would go back to its roots and recognise that conservatism is not about neoconservatism, which was all about radical changes and imposing a will on another people, of course, which actually originates from the left. The true conservatism comes from the philosophy of Edmund Burke, which is about gradual organic change, and the fact that institutions exist for a reason, and it's best not to sweep them away as they were in, say, for instance, the French Revolution. So really a true conservative recognises that we need good relations with Iran, and rather than follow the Blairite policy of so-called liberal interventionism, which was one of really neoconservatism, where they're imposing their will on other countries, which has had disastrous results. So the Conservative Party is, of course, also the party of business. It is the party of encouraging economic growth. It is the party of investment in the private sector, because that delivers better outcomes for all. Of course, many at the top will benefit the most, but people at the lower end of the income spectrum will also benefit, and that's the best way to generate a prosperous economy, which is also the only way that you can have an economy that can provide efficient good quality public services if there's a good, strong tax base from a growing economy. So the Conservative Party should, of course, abandon the ideology of Tony Blair and George Bush, and which were, of course, American, but of course Tony Blair was Labour, and follow the path of recognising that we need to engage positively. We need to recognise that other countries have a different way of doing things at a different pace, at a different time, and just engage and try and make money, which would be to the better of Britain and, of course, Iran as well.
Do you think in the future, when it comes to the Labour Party and where Mr. Jeremy Corbyn to win the leadership of his party, obviously this is a gentleman who looks at things internally. Do you think he will have the same tact at making the best out of this opportunity with Iran as the Conservative Party you just argued will?
Yeah, I knew Jeremy Corbyn approximately 15 years ago. I knew him well through charity work that we were both engaged in here, supporting a charity that I was involved with. I think he will have a common sense approach, not an imperialist approach. And I think either way, I don't think Jeremy Corbyn will necessarily ever be Prime Minister, although he may actually be the Labour leader, and that's probably a very likely outcome. They'd be the leader of Her Majesty's opposition within the United Kingdom. But either way, I think the future would be positive engagement with Iran from the United Kingdom, and that's to be welcomed, because for a long time, you mentioned earlier about the mistrust that Iranians have towards Britain. Well, this is something that's actually deeply ingrained in their culture, going back over centuries, about British bullying of Iran, going back to Britain trying to secure the Raj in India, trying to limit Iranian involvement in Afghanistan, which of course hasn't worked out well, and going also to the overthrow of Mossadegh, which is of course funded by the CIA, but the main impetus for that came from the United Kingdom. And this is so deeply ingrained within Iranian culture that there was actually an Iranian television program going back a number of decades now, excuse my pronunciation, but Darji Napoleon, Uncle Napoleon, where everything that bad happened to Uncle Napoleon, which was this elderly gentleman in this series, he always blamed on the British. And that was, of course, a funny programme, but it was making a statement about a real situation where people in Iran have not trusted Britain. So this is a good opportunity for the UK to improve its relations with Iran, to say, look, we're not going to negatively interfere in your country, in your internal politics, we're just going to trade with you. And then, of course, this is a new opportunity for us and a good opportunity for Iran as well.
Dr. Kalawoon, now the infrastructures in the economies, for instance, the new economies, the oil economies in the UAE particularly proved a success when it comes to telecommunications, logistics, travel and construction and the petrochemical sector. Now, I mention the UAE due to business-friendly relations and the contribution that Iranian skill has been seen throughout the building of the UAE and Dubai particularly. Now, do you think we could see large-scale business deals between the two countries vis-à-vis what is aspired to by the West? Do you think the UAE will have a chance there?
Well, there are two views on this, that UAE and Dubai in particular benefited from sanctions by cutting through deals behind the eyes of the sanctions with Iran, which made good profit for UAE traders and for Iranian traders. Now there is a view to say this one, it won't last, because everything will be on the table and Iran doesn't need UAE brokers in this way. And I may disagree with this a little bit, because there are other venues of cooperation. As I said, with Qatar, there is a gas field. Now there is a tension with Kuwait, there is a gas field as well. So if you take away the poisonous relationship and Iran changes its own behavior and GCC give away through Iranian new behavior. Suspicions, I think economic cooperation benefit to everyone. I have been attending here in London for a long time many exhibitions, from tourism to food stuff to aviation to security, and Iran was absent from every one of them. There is no Iranian pavilion in any of them, which means Iran not in the international economy. Doesn't mean Iran is not important, but I mean it was prevented, or it didn't have the wish or the strategy to be there. Now this one will be open. No wonder Qatar is everywhere, having big pavilions, whatever. Iran can do it. It has the manpower, it has everything behind it. So I agree with you, investment, and I think this is a winning card with GCC. It means also reducing defense budgets on both sides of the Arabian Gulf and from the Persian side as well. This will benefit the peoples of both blocks, as they are high spenders of buying military hardware. Nuclear power program in Iran is highly costly. So I see that taking away the military and the regional tension and sectarian tension will benefit both blocks, not only UAE. Not to forget there is a religious tourism as well. To the Hajj pilgrimage in Saudi Arabia and in Mecca and Medina, and Iran and Saudi had in the past a kind of tension, sometimes clashes. So if we take away the poison of Shia Sunni, competition or clashes or whatever, they will see many Arabs going to Iran, not only Shia, and many Iranians coming Iraq to Saudi Arabia to everywhere. So there is a win-win situation for the deal, the nuclear deal with the West and Iran, and also with Iran and the Arab world. I think now there is a kind of way to have a kind of annex to the deal to say to Iran, be good to the Arabs. It's not out of generosity or ihsan, or charity, but it's a way to be win-win to otherwise you have the tension around the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, and everybody would be losing. So I think Iran is on a good test to prove that it can do according and behave politically and economically according to international norms. And the big gift was it to enter into World Trade Organization, an organization and other bodies which let Iranian exports flourish and encourage it through trade.
And there's a larger expatriate presence also from the Iranian community in the GCC, particularly in the UAE. So it's always good also to
obviously, when I was in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, I got Iranian traders giving me favorable treatment because I'm Lebanese. So it tells you how the regional feelings can be built up of being on the good behavior side. It's easy and can be done.
Definitely. Mr. Ols, my last question today. Where do you see all of this going? Israel's Prime Minister is adamant to try anything for sanctions on Iran to remain in place. So obviously, Mr. Netanyahu, will this put the West in a position with Israel when it comes to those investments? And what's the best way out of it vis-à-vis Israel, of course?
Benjamin Netanyahu is currently a massive impediment to peace in the region. His intransigence in Palestine, as many people call it, is just really not very helpful.
But then when people chant death to Israel and death to America, so
that's regularly chanted, but that's been happening for quite some time. But that's not actually a recognition of foreign policy. People share those opinions around the world in many different countries. That doesn't necessarily represent the actual government and what's really happening on the ground about wanting to have a positive engagement. That's what we can quite clearly see from Iran, which is perhaps one reason why in the Iranian elections there was, of course, 4 so-called hardliners splitting the vote and only 1 moderate allowed to stand. Naturally, the moderate would win under such circumstances. It seems that the leader of Iran was, of course, and the council that decided who could stand in the presidential elections was actually perhaps pushing for a moderate to be elected as the most likely outcome. That's really a difference that needs to be taken into account, and we need to see that really Israel is actually isolating itself at this time. President Obama in the United States recognises that before he leaves office he must solve this problem. It's a very controversial issue in the United States. There's a massive campaign about whether the sanctions should be put in place or kept in place or abolished. The Hollywood actors are involved, senators are involved, the normal interest groups are involved. Obama recognises he has to solve this. This has to be his legacy to the world before he leaves office in a couple of years' time. That's something that he must actually deliver on, and hopefully it will be delivered, and hopefully the extremists in America who are following the Israeli line, or the line of Benjamin Netanyahu rather, will not scupper this deal.
But what's the best way out of it, again, when it comes to Israel? They're still not happy with you doing business with Iran, for instance.
Well, it becomes a point where Israel is, well, Benjamin Netanyahu, really not all Israelis, but Benjamin Netanyahu is being somewhat ridiculous when he talks about, in Iran people can't wear jeans, just a ridiculous statement. It becomes hysterical. It becomes a point where we cannot allow Israel to have, or Benjamin Netanyahu rather, to have a veto on Western foreign policy.
Human rights are an issue, though, never mind jeans, but human rights are an issue in Iran.
They are an issue across every single state, and yet Israel has under the table alliances with countries that have far worse human rights record than Iran. America has as one of its closest allies, of course, Israel, which has many aspects of human rights abuses against some Palestinians. Of course, and America has good relations with Saudi Arabia. Human rights is only a smokescreen for a further crackdown from various elements on what they see as the growth of Iranian and Shia power within the Middle East. But actually, they're fighting the wrong battle, and they need to recognise that it wasn't the Iranians that were committing atrocities against the United States, such as 9/11. It's not the Iranians who are involved in the human rights abuses in Syria or Iraq. It's actually the Salafist groups, which America, through ignorance or inaction, has actually allowed to prosper.
As this interesting discussion comes to an end, I'd like to leave us with an American point of view, now that you mentioned, on the nuclear deal, with a comment by Doreen Kent Duncan from the Wall Street Journal. The nuclear deal, quote, did not say Congress approval was necessary for it to take effect. For that matter, it's already taking effect. Some countries have already promised weapons, and many are attempting economic dealings. Iran is in pretty good shape, thanks to our so-called president. Of course, she's referring to the deal's main driver, President Barack Obama there. Let me thank our guest here at the studio, Dr. Nasser Al-Kalawoon, Professor of Economics, and British military historian, Mr. Robert Olds. Thank you very much. Also a councillor in the London Borough of Hounslow and the director of the Bruges Group. Stay tuned to Straightforward for more discussions on matters that matter in the Middle East. And I'll be with you again soon. Bye for now.